Introducing Punchbowl News. From Anna Palmer, Jake Sherman, and John Bresnahan. News about the people who matter, for the people who matter. Join the community at punchbowl.news.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Anna Palmer, CEO and founder of Punchbowl News. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon for a pop-up virtual conversation with Washington Democrat Susan DelBene. She is also chair of the New Democrat Coalition. We are going to discuss news of the day, as well as focus on child poverty and the impact of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit on low-income communities. A big thank you to the Rockefeller Foundation for making this conversation possible. After our conversation, I'll be joined by Sam Hammond, Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center, and Jessica Fulton, Vice President of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, for a fireside chat. A quick reminder that Punchbowl News is on all social media platforms at Punchbowl News, and I am at @APalmerDC. We encourage you to share about the conversation. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Representative DelBene to the stage for our conversation. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, we picked a very, very busy time to do this conversation, so I really appreciate it. We've been going back with the action between the House and the Senate, in particular, passing both the way for Democrats to raise the debt ceiling, as well as the National Defense Authorization Act. In the House this week, it's now moving over to the Senate. Just want to get your read on this. How confident are you that Congress is going to act to raise the debt limit ceiling before this December deadline?
You know, I feel pretty confident. Clearly, it is in the hands of the Senate right now to move forward, but this is critically important. I wish we weren't in a place where we were voting on this again. We should have dealt with this earlier when we kind of had the last vote to extend the debt ceiling for a couple of months. But we need to maintain the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. It is something that should be bipartisan and pretty easy thing to do. Unfortunately, it's been a little bit more challenging, but I think we're on a path to get it done.
All right. Well, the House is expected to come back to vote next week to do that. But there is, as long as everything goes as it's supposed to in the Senate right now. But otherwise, the House doesn't have any votes scheduled until January 10th. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, even as early as this morning, has been pushing to say that he is going to get the Build Back Better Act done before the end of the year, although that seems like a big lift, to say the least. Can you talk a little bit about what's realistic for Democrats? Do you think it's actually realistic to get this done before the end of the year? Or do you see this really much more as a Q1 2022, bill that's actually when that actually might pass?
Well, first of all, I think we have to get it done by the end of the year because there are important provisions like the child tax credit the expanded child tax credit that would expire at the end of the year if we don't move before then. From a House standpoint, we are assuming we'll be here next week and understand that we have to be flexible. I think that's House leadership has said, be flexible so that we can respond when the Senate sends legislation back our way. So we'll be prepared to do that and hope that they move quickly. But we need to move quickly. There's been a long conversation about the Build Back Better Act. It's important that we decide, move forward so we can really help the American people, and very specifically so that the child tax credit continues. Those checks that went out on December 15th or that are going out on December 15th, that those continue and checks go out on January 15th as well.
All right. Well, this is a good segue into the conversation that we are going to have, really focused on child poverty, on poverty in general. I know this is an area you have focused on in particular. You introduced legislation on this. Bottom line, why is this issue? Why is the child tax credit? Why is the EITC so important?
So when we were, have been looking at ways that we can really make sure that we are helping American people, helping people to thrive, Some of the most important things we can do are to use tax policy to help families. Both the child tax credit, which we expanded as part of the American Rescue Plan, and the earned income tax credit, the EITC. We kind of have acronym tax credit challenges for folks. Those are incredibly important to helping families get by, and not only get by, but be in a place where they can thrive. The child tax credit was expanded in the American Rescue Plan, and one of the big pieces of that was that we really made sure the tax credit was available to everyone. About a third of families had been left behind with the tax credit that Republicans put in place because people didn't make enough money to have enough taxes to offset with a tax credit. So what we did is we made it refundable in the American Rescue Plan. So even if you don't make enough to offset your taxes, we will make sure you get the rest of that money directly paid to you. And then we made it what's called advanceable, which is a monthly payment. And those are the monthly payments that started going out on July 15th. Similarly, with the earned income tax credit, we wanted to make sure that we were preventing millions of childless workers who were actually struggling because the earned income tax credit didn't help them in the way it needed to. It excluded workers without children, providing a tiny benefit to a small number of these workers. And so we made fixes in the American Rescue Plan to increase the earned income tax credit for childless workers, and eliminate the age gap for younger and older workers. So this made a huge difference, helping make sure that we're helping lift people out of poverty. And already with the child tax credit, with those payments going out since July 15th, we've seen over 3 million children lifted out of poverty, but they're not going to stay out of poverty if we don't make sure we make a long-term investment. And that's why making sure we get Build Back Better across is so important, because otherwise, the policy will expire at the end of this month.
Let's talk about that. You talked about kind of the Republicans and what they had done before, how Democrats have kind of built this into a much bigger, robust program. How do you respond to some of your Republican colleagues who have said the CTC, the child tax credit in particular, is an example of things in Build Back Better Act that don't actually lift children out of poverty, or that the money isn't going to the essentials? What do you say to your Republican colleagues that are continuing to have, say those statements on the news and publicly and privately?
Well, first I say, talk to people about the impact of the child tax credit. Talk to families what they're using that money for. Diapers, food. In fact, we've seen an incredible impact on families being able to put food on the table since checks started going out. To pay for housing, folks talking about being able to fix a car to help their family get around, or to help a parent go to work, being able to buy school supplies or clothing, or help pay for housing. If you talk to families about the impact it has, it's been very clear that not only is it helping families and helping children to thrive, it's also helping parents to be able to go to work. All of the things that those are really the impacts that are a result. And yet somehow there's been this description of it being something that has not gone to folks who really need it. This has been incredibly important for families across the country. And frankly, other countries have had similar types of policies in place that also have really shown incredible results. There's great data on the child tax credit in terms of its ability to lift children out of poverty. And we're seeing that already just with the few months that the checks have been going out since July 15th. 3 million children lifted out of poverty. That's pretty incredible in such a short period of time. So let's help our kids. Let's invest in our kids. And that ends up giving us a great return on our investment, with kids being able to thrive and the long-term impacts that would have on our communities.
So, let's zoom in into your home state of Washington State. And we often in DC think we're the only state, but I see you have your state flag up there. Talk about the impact that you've seen. I was pulling some numbers earlier today, and they were saying, the CTC payments in particular, which were part of that American Rescue Plan, the Treasury and the IRS reported that 1.4 million children in Washington State received $343 million in benefits. Are you hearing from constituents? Do they need more? Is there any opportunity to build this out broader, or do you think what was put into the plan and an extension of it is what's needed to be done?
We've heard really strong feedback from families across Washington State. We know that there were children in Washington State who are left out of the full child tax credit before we passed this expansion in the American Rescue Plan. 30% of Washington children were left out. Now we've got about 1.4 million children in Washington receiving the expanded child tax credit. And what's so important is that we see the impact of it helping to lift children out of poverty. The one thing we hear from folks, which is what we're talking about right now, is they want to make sure that this is something they can depend on going forward. Children don't grow up in a year. They don't grow up in 2 years or 5 years. And for us to really see the long-term impact, to truly lift children out of poverty, to truly make changes for them and long-term outcomes, we should make it permanent. And I've fought to make it permanent. We have a 1-year extension in the Build Back Better Act. And we also have policy there to make it fully refundable, which means we don't leave behind those 30% of children who are left behind before. That's an important piece of Build Back Better. But that 1-year extension of the child tax credit and checks going out, we're going to fight right away, right after we get the Build Back Better bill done, to get that extension even longer, because families just want to know it's going to be there. And I do think it's important for us to have long-term durable policy, which is why I've been fighting from the beginning to see it be made permanent.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering. And 65 million kids would lose out. Nearly 10 million would be plunged back below the poverty line or even deeper into poverty. When you look at the earned income tax credit, they also have, really large numbers in terms of what the impact would be if this doesn't get extended, if the Build Back Better Act doesn't happen by the end of the year. We're talking about 3 weeks, basically. And Congress doesn't often move fast. There's a lot of opposition, particularly, Senator Joe Manchin has said, he doesn't feel the need to do this before the end of the year. What's your message to Joe Manchin?
My message is we absolutely have to do it by the end of the year. There's a consequence to not getting it done earlier. The child tax credit expires, the impact that has right away on families, to your point, who have benefited already. And how many policies we can talk about where we see such an immediate impact, such an immediate positive impact on families, to see that investment, to lose that investment that we've already made, if we don't keep going, we could potentially see those children go back into poverty. That's why this is so important. But there's a lot of other reasons. The sooner we start addressing issues like housing, climate, childcare, the sooner we get those programs up and running and started, the sooner we address long-term problems that families have been facing. And so when we look at all the pieces of Build Back Better, there's short-term impacts, there's long-term impacts, but we need to get started. And the sooner we get started, the sooner our communities benefit from that. So the longer we wait, the longer we aren't providing those resources, helping folks out. And of course, we go backwards if we wait too long.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the CTC, but the earned income tax credit, stats show that it would hit 5.8 million people who would be taxed if this provision doesn't get extended. Talk about inflation, the economy, the job, and the workforce. Those are kind of a lot of focus right now in Washington, certainly throughout the country. Does inflation and the state of the economy make this a bigger hurdle to get people on board with this issue?
Well, actually, I think it makes a strong case of why it's so important that we continue to move forward. The disproportionate impacts that the pandemic has had, the so many things that pre-existed, poverty, childhood poverty pre-existed the pandemic. It was made worse by the pandemic. The struggles that families have had with childcare or housing pre-existed the pandemic. Those continue. So these resources aren't just resources that were put in place to address the pandemic. It was incredibly important and why we included them in the American Rescue Plan. But these are policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, like the Child Tax Credit. These are long-term policies to help address communities that have been left behind for far too long. And so we have to make sure that folks understand that this wasn't just ever thought of as short-term policy. This was always thought of as long-term policy, helping lift families out of poverty to get by, to pay for essentials. And clearly, if costs go up in certain areas, we see that having a harder impact on these families. So I'd argue it actually makes even a stronger case of why we need to make sure we get legislation passed right away and help these families, because they're paying for things like diapers and food and housing. This isn't folks going out these are essential things that families need to get by, that they can't necessarily just avoid to put off to another time. And that's also why monthly checks are important, because folks need those resources to get by right now.
So first step, obviously, what happens with the Build Back Better Act. Next, in terms of trying to, I think your effort is to try to make this a permanent fixture, not just an extended by a year. Is there anything else that when you look at these issues, when you look at poverty and what is happening either on the tax code or elsewhere, that you think, you're going to kind of turn your attention to, that you still think needs to be a focus here?
Well, long-term durable policy is important. So absolutely, I'll reiterate it just so everyone heard it if they didn't hear it before, that making the expanded child tax credit permanent is key to that. Obviously, the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, the CDCTC, is also a critical tool. We didn't talk about that, but those three really are very, very important to helping families. But when we look at tax credit or tax policy broadly, we're also doing a lot of work with the low-income housing tax credit. In fact, there's legislation that I've led in the House and Senator Cantwell's led in the Senate, pieces of that in the Build Back Better Act as well, to help us get more affordable housing built across the country, because we don't have enough inventory. The low-income housing tax credit's been out there and helped build about 90% of our affordable housing across the country, or help refurbish it. These are long-term investments that give us a long-term return. And I think that's when we look broadly at what we can do in tax policy. It's making sure that we are making those investments now and setting up not only folks today, but also our next generation for success.
All right. Well, we are quickly running out of time, but before I let you run, it is a big day in the DelBene household. Your husband, Kurt, has a hearing for his nomination to be Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs for Information and Technology. You're going to be there watching him, I assume?
I am. Our kids are in town too, so we're all going to go over, and I guess I get to go over to the Senate side and be there to support him. So looking forward to that. It'll be a little bit different experience for me, but very excited for that. He would do an incredible job.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time on a busy day. I really appreciate it. And now I'd like to begin the Fires Chat portion of the conversation and welcome Sam Hammond, Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center, and Jessica Fulton, Vice President of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, to the virtual stage. Sam and Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we covered a ton in the editorial portion of the conversation with Representative DelBene, talking about poverty, talking about the childhood tax credit, the earned income tax credit. I want to let's just zoom out a little bit. I think I asked her at the beginning, but I'd love to ask you, and maybe Sam, I'll start with you, and then we can go to Jessica. But Why is this issue? I mean, there's a lot that's in the Build Back Better Act that Democrats are trying to get accomplished, but why do you see this issue and this topic so important?
Oh, it's incredibly important. In many ways, with the child tax credit, the United States is just playing catch up. I believe the United Kingdom brought in their first child allowance in 1945. This is a policy innovation in the U.S. context, but on the international stage, it's the norm to have unconditional child support for families across the board, middle class, lower income, upper income. And the pandemic has really laid bare the need for something like this, both because of the labor market disruptions that have taken place and people having to undertake childcare and rearrange their childcare arrangements, in some cases turning to family and friends. But then also because of the rising cost of living across the country for core household necessities. And when you've looked at studies of programs like the child tax credit in the US and similar programs abroad, what you find is a huge rate of return. So a recent study in the US context found the child tax credit has an 8x return from benefits over costs, and that's driven by improved health outcomes, educational outcomes. There's even evidence that children that receive the child tax credit grow up to have higher earnings in adulthood and then end up paying higher taxes that more than offset the cost of the program. So now is really the time to fill that gap. Prior to the expansion, roughly 27 million kids didn't receive the full credit. And when you looked at why people turn to our safety net programs, public assistance programs, 1 in 4 poverty spells are driven by having a child. Within middle income households, $30,000 to $75,000. 1 in 3 of those households say that they turn to public assistance during parental leave. Prior to this expansion, we lived in a country, in an economy where having a child was itself a risk factor for poverty, and that should never be the case.
Jessica, anything that, kind of Sam laid out a lot in terms of kind of the history of it on the world stage, as well as what the impact has been on here in the US, but any thoughts kind of, more broadly, just, from your perspective, why this is such an important issue, why these provisions are so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sam kind of laid out the case for why the child tax credit is so important. I think I will focus a little bit on the earned income tax credit in particular. So we've expanded temporarily the earned income tax credit in the American Rescue Plan for 1 year. What we're going to see next year when folks start to file their taxes is that we're essentially keeping millions of workers from being taxed into poverty. What people may not know is that folks who don't have children, childless adults, are the only group that we allow to be taxed, even if they earn just above the poverty line. We allow them to be taxed into poverty because they don't get this credit, right? Workers who are just starting out their careers, under 25. These are folks who are trying to build a foundation for their life. They're maybe working hourly jobs, they're trying to make ends meet, and we don't provide them any support as it stands. And so this is really an opportunity to provide those folks with the kind of boost that they may need to kind of get their feet on the ground, right? Start to develop what they need to do to kind of build their families. And I think one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that a lot of the workers that would benefit from this, so like cooks, cashiers, retail workers, those are the folks who really kept our economy going. They weren't rewarded with extra pay, right? Like they weren't rewarded with any kind of other benefits. Essentially, we said, y'all have to keep working to support us. And this is really an opportunity to say, we don't want you to be put into a worse situation when we have a policy out there that can be tweaked just a bit to help you make ends meet.
Jessica, I want to focus on something that Congressman DelBene and I were talking a little bit about, which is the economy, inflation, 2 big issue areas. I think a lot of people wonder on some of these tax credits, if we're fighting inflation, is this the time for this now? Can you talk about, why you think this is important, or what the impact inflation and the status of the economy should or shouldn't have on this issue?
Yeah, I think economists have talked about the fact that this won't actually affect inflation. But I think in addition to that, we know that if costs are rising for some families, this is precisely the time to make sure that people have the money in their pockets to make the payments they need to make. We're about to go into January, which means that folks who have student loans are going to start to have to pay those back. And at the Joint Center, we do our research focuses on Black communities. We know that Black women in particular hold significantly more student loan debt than other borrowers, right? So we're really concerned that people are kind of taking on these extra burdens. And we're at the same time, it seems, trying to pull back support because they won't be able to get the January child tax credit payments. It doesn't make sense, and it's a little bit concerning.
Obviously, we are watching, as you all are, and our readers at Punchbowl News are, what's going to happen with the Build Back Better Act. We have Senator Chuck Schumer saying, he's pushing, trying to do everything he can to get it done by Christmas. I think that would probably be a Christmas miracle at this point, just given where they are and everything that needs to happen. But Sam, can you just lay out, like, if these two provisions aren't extended, right? The deadline is the 31st. What is the impact? I think sometimes these large programs, it's hard to kind of understand the tangible impact, but this really is something where you can kind of see what's going to happen for families, but also for those, that are getting that earned income tax credit as well.
Yeah, just the child tax credit on its own has had the effect of reducing child poverty by 40%, eliminating extreme child poverty and cutting deep child poverty in half, right? So if this isn't extended, the first effect will be to reverse those gains. I think moreover, like above and beyond just the poverty impact, one of the benefits, the values of a program like the child tax credit, particularly as it's become monthly, is the degree of stability and certainty that it provides families to budget over the year. The fact that you have at the middle of the month this reliable source of income supplementation means that you can plan for taking your kids to Disneyland or paying that rent or whatever your household need is, because we know that household needs are incredibly diverse. And that's actually one of the reasons why folks on the right, the conservatives, have also gravitated towards ideas like the child tax credit and child allowances, is because that household stability factor, it turns out, leads to many other conservative ends as well, including stabler families, lower rates of divorce, lower rates of child abuse and neglect. And that we completely obviate that source of stability if we're continuously debating this every year. Imagine if Social Security checks were debated every year whether they're going to be extended and how much uncertainty that would bring to our retirees. And so, making this permanent, but also giving a robust extension is essential to getting many of the positive social benefits that the child tax credit can and should have, because it provides that certainty, that provides that platform. And as it affects local economies, this is money that goes right back into local communities, and that ends up shaping those communities. So families will be pooling their resources to establish childcare arrangements, or the restaurant scene in a neighborhood will become a little bit more family friendly, or what have you. But for all those changes to take place, there has to be a degree of permanency to the program, because if it just whiplashes back and forth, no one's ever going to make those investments.
All right, we are quickly running out of time, but I want to go to both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Jessica. As you look at 2022, child poverty more broadly, we've talked about the need, from both of your perspective, to extend these provisions, as well as potentially make them permanent. What would be your message to Congress and the White House be right now in terms of what they're doing on these issues, as well as maybe what more they need to be doing?
I really see this as an opportunity to do what helps the folks who are most vulnerable in our country, but also to help our economy as a whole, right? We know that both of these provisions allow people to get back to work. We know that both of these provisions allow people to support their families. And just as Sam has explained, they help to support local economies. It's really an opportunity and an example of the way that we can start with doing what's right for households, and how that affects all of us, that we all get to pull together right now and help one another. And that's something that I think it somehow gets lost in a lot of these conversations as people are trying to talk about. I don't really understand why we wouldn't. So,
all right, Sam, anything to add on that note?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a very divided country, and a program like the child tax credit, or even the ITC, they both have long standing bipartisan pedigrees. And the child tax credit in particular, as it's becoming this broad-based child allowance, which extends to the lowest income to the middle income, it really denotes a kind of solidarity, a national solidarity, which I think is really lacking right now, because everyone either will have kids and raise family, or were once a kid themselves, and so can appreciate the value this program has.
All right. And with that, Sam and Jessica, I'm sorry we are all out of time. Thank you both so much for joining us for this important conversation. A big thank you to Representative DelBene for joining us to discuss child poverty and the Build Back Better Act, and a very big thank you to the Rockefeller Foundation for making this conversation possible, and to all of you for joining us for this 30 minutes. A reminder that next week I will be back for a conversation with Senator Susan Collins, Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. I hope you will join us for that conversation on broadband and the infrastructure bill. Have a great day, and please stay safe.